I'd like to welcome everyone to this joint Baker Institute Carnegie Conference on Religious Authority in the Middle East, Implications for U.S. Policy. My name is Sarah Yerkes. I'm a fellow here at the Carnegie Endowment. And we at Carnegie are honored that Kadir and his team asked us to serve as the Washington host for the launch of this very interesting body of work. We're looking forward to a day full of discussion at the intersection of academia and policy, looking at the role that religious actors play within their own societies and how U.S. policymakers can better understand those dynamics. And now I'd like to turn it over to Kadir, who will provide a more formal introduction to the conference. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Sarah. As the Baker Institute, we want to thank the Carnegie Endowment for hosting us here. And in particular, I want to thank Sarah and Nathan Brown for making this happen. And I also want to acknowledge Henry Luce Foundation for their support for our study, without which our study wouldn't be successful. And I also want to say that I feel incredibly privileged and humbled to be here, to be speaking at this venue and in front of a distinguished audience that not only includes my esteemed colleagues in this project, but also others like Sarah, Nathan, Sean, and Peter. If and when I say something wrong, I'm safe in the knowledge that they will correct me. Religion and religious authority are incredibly valuable political resources, especially at a time when religion's prominence has risen in recent years and decades in the political arena, something that we know in particular, but also over in the Middle East and North Africa region. Various religio-political actors, such as Islamists and fundamentalists or Salafi groups, and governments use religion in one form or another for their political purposes throughout the region, because authority in Islam is decentralized and hierarchical, with the exception of some Shiite group circles. Dynamics of a free market of religion and religious competition define politics-religion relationship across the region. Yet, despite its centrality to a well-grounded understanding, conception of how religion and politics interact, and to understanding the motivations behind religious actors' actions, we lack a comprehensive analysis of this key concept of Islamic authority, religious authority in the Middle East. Our study examines the nature of religious authority in contemporary Middle East, and we ask, who speaks for Islam in the Middle East, and who wields religious authority? Three key observations about the region's religious space motivated our study. First, Islamist actors across the region have enjoyed widespread electoral popularity for decades. Does this electoral popularity translate into religious favorability and authority for Islamists? This is a very important and politically pertinent question. Second, state-affiliated religious leaders are generally assumed to lack the charisma, intrigue, and authority other religious leaders are deemed to possess because of their proximity to political power. So state affiliation is presumed to undermine their authority. How much influence and authority do state religious officials actually have? And lastly, there are some strong undercurrents of extremism in the region, sometimes violently, as evidenced by the presence of Islamic State and Al-Qaeda affiliates. But is there a strong societal support base for extremists among the broader populations in the region? So as part of this study, we conducted an original 12-country online public opinion survey that asked about 16,500 respondents their views on more than 80 religious leaders from across the region. These leaders hailed from quite different backgrounds. Some were traditional religious scholars, others state-affiliated, Sufis, televangelists, and others were more politically oriented, like the Islamists, Salafis, and Jihadis. Just a quick note about the survey. Our survey is not representative at the national level. So there's proportionately male, more educated, and more urban. However, on some other variables, especially that relate to religion, religious attitudes, religious behavior, it is fairly comparable to the broader populations that they're drawn from. So, and we have more information, detailed information about the survey in our appendix online. Our survey included direct questions about the respondents' approval of and trust in these religious leaders in every country. But our study went beyond asking directly. We know this is a sensitive topic, especially given the, in some contexts, authoritarian nature of regimes. So not everyone is going to come out and reveal their true preferences in our survey. So to this end, we decided to measure this more indirectly. So we used endorsement experiments. This experimental design allowed us to make a series of religious statements the focus of respondents' evaluation instead of the religious leaders themselves. So we would give them a statement, a religious statement, and we would attribute that statement to a particular religious leader. And we varied this for each respondent. So we had 14 this kind of question, 14 endorsement experiments, and we had 13 leaders plus a no endorsement option as the baseline to compare to. So this combination of alternative methods to map religious authority in the region enabled us to reach a more comprehensive set of conclusions than we would be able to using by a single method. The results depict a complex religious space in the Middle East that reflects its citizens' nuanced approach toward religion and religion politics relationship. So we have three main findings. The first one is that we find that the popularity and religious influence of Islamist actors notably vary across the region. On one hand, Islamist figures in our survey received fairly high levels of approval from respondents in most countries in our survey. Likewise, they were found to be trustworthy in most countries in our survey. Again, there are a couple countries in which Islamists were not as much favored, such as Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, for example. But in most other countries, they were. On the other hand, survey respondents were notably more lukewarm about Islamists when their views are put into specific context. In terms of religio-political issues, we asked them indirectly in the endorsement experiments. Islamist names typically garnered a negative endorsement score in our endorsement experiments, indicating that respondents were less likely to agree with a statement when they saw the name of an Islamist figure. A second finding of our study is that we fundamentally challenge the conventional wisdom about the influence of state religious actors. Our study shows that state-affiliated religious leaders have largely outperformed our expectations. And to begin with, this was also our own expectation as a team in this study. This finding holds true, and this is true both in trust, being trustworthy, and having the approval of respondents. And this is true almost without exception in every single country in our study, which I thought was impressive. This finding also holds true with the endorsement experiments. Importantly, state-affiliated religious officials have the most influence in countries where the state employs religion and religious discourse as a key element of its national identity in countries such as Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Iran, and Jordan. However, considered in tandem with the relatively weak performance of Islamists in our study, especially in endorsement experiments, this finding suggests that the support that state religious actors received from respondents in our survey is conditional upon ensuring a non-partisan approach to religion. And we had another experiment in our survey which actually reaffirmed our finding in this part of our survey. So we were pretty confident in our result. Maintaining that non-partisan position is key to their stature as legitimate religious authorities from the perspective of respondents in our survey. Lastly, the most concerning finding in our study is that extremist religious discourse has a sizable audience. Respondents in our survey did not express support for local or transnational extremist figures, when asked directly in our survey, in the approval questions and trustworthiness. And we asked about al-Baghdadi, ISIS Islamic State leader al-Baghdadi, in every single country, and he did not get any traction in direct questions. However, endorsement question revealed a dramatically different picture. In several countries, al-Baghdadi was among the most favorably viewed religious leaders when asked indirectly in endorsement experiments. So when we asked their views on different religious statements, people in several countries were more likely to agree with this statement when they saw the name of Islamic State leader al-Baghdadi. And this was particularly pronounced in Tunisia, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Morocco. And these are the very countries that sent the highest number of foreign fighters into Syria to fight alongside the Islamic State. So we have external validation of our finding in our study. So what do these findings suggest? It is important to caution against securitizing U.S. foreign policy engagement with religion in the Middle East because it carries a serious risk of delegitimizing the local religious actors who are involved in such engagements. There are a lot of counter-violent extremism programs that are going on. So this is particularly a concern for state religious officials who are viewed and instrumentalized as agents of moderation. Religion permeates various aspects of life in societies across the Middle East. And if you follow a lot of these surveys, and this was also evident in our survey, we asked the same question, how important religion is in your life. And overwhelming majorities in every country throughout the region indicate that religion is very important in their lives. So in that sense, this is very important. So reducing religion to extremism only is problematic. Reducing it to extremism and extremist violence alone compromises the ability of U.S. foreign policy to engage with a much larger population and on a broader set of issues. Relatedly, our research shows that state religious actors enjoy significant influence and power that hinge on local circumstances. As such, state religious officials' potential to act as legitimate religious authorities offers an opportunity to promote reform in social issues such as education, women's rights, and pluralism, and democratization more broadly that are not directly related to extremism in the society. Examples of such policies have been employed in countries like Tunisia and Jordan in recent years in regard to equal inheritance and family planning. Simultaneously, however, this influence and power of state religious authorities is precarious because of its proximity to political power. So the way to engage them or the way to empower them must be undertaken delicately. Lastly, the mixed performance of Islamist actors in our study reflects their complicated legacy throughout the region. Even when Islamists and to some degree Salafists fail to resonate strongly with respondents as religious authorities in our survey, there is extensive evidence for the support that they enjoy as leaders in most countries throughout the region. So it is important to recognize that they represent a particular societal bloc, and just ignoring them entirely, not recognizing them as legitimate actors in their societies is problematic because they're simply not going to go away. So such nuanced support for Islamists, recognizing them as legitimate political actors in their sort of broad appeal to religious values, but not so much as religious authorities directly. That this nuanced support for Islamists underscores the importance of engaging them in efforts to find long-lasting solutions to major public policy issues in regional countries. Their absence from these processes carries the risk of delegitimizing reform efforts right from the beginning. The recent public debates on equal inheritance in Tunisia show that Islamists can play the role of spoilers in social reform efforts, just as they can reinforce reform and democratization efforts like Ennahda did in the aftermath of the Jasmine Revolution. And we have an in-house expert with Sharon here who can speak to this more. So our study shows a strong strain of support that Islamic State leader al-Baghdadi enjoys in several countries in the region. While this support oftentimes does not translate into support for local extremists, and this is, I think, a very important finding, in any meaningful way, it nonetheless reveals a concerning trend and helps explain why certain countries in the region send high numbers of foreign fighters into Syria. Two important points must be raised here in light of our study. First, while immediate military action against extremist groups and violent groups may be warranted in certain contexts in order to address human suffering and geopolitical ramifications of the Islamic State presence in the region, such action should absolutely complemented by a long-term strategy to undertake broad efforts at social reform in order to curb undercurrent of support for extremism in the region. Critically, the complex nature of religious affair should be harnessed in this process, as our study shows. In particular, religious actors who enjoy broad legitimacy as religious authorities should constitute a key element of these efforts. Second, looking at extremism and extremist violence in the region, our study shows that one of the important motivators of support for extremism in the region is U.S. Foreign policy and actions on the ground in the region. So it is of utmost importance that U.S. policy and actions in the region are calibrated with the religious landscape in mind. A region where religion is deemed to be quite important in the lives of the people, this is very important to be able to gain a little bit more traction in terms of policies on the ground. I will finish by saying that our reports, most of our reports are published. They're available outside in printed form. Help yourselves. They're also available online through the Carnegie event website, but also through the Baker Institute page. And we will have more reports and policy briefs coming in the coming weeks. So be on the watch out for those. Now I want to introduce our first keynote speaker for the day, Sean Casey. Dr. Sean Casey is the director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University and a professor of the practice in Georgetown's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Sean previously was U.S. Special Representative for Religion and Global Affairs and the founding director of the U.S. Department of State's Office of Religion and Global Affairs. He has also had positions at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., and the Center for American Progress and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Casey has written on the ethics of the war in Iraq, as well as the role of religion in American presidential politics. He's the author of The Making of a Catholic President, Kennedy versus Nixon, 1960. He's the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Political Theology. He is currently working on a book on ethics and international politics, tentatively titled Niebuhr's Children. Casey holds a BA from Abilene Christian University, an MPA from Harvard Kennedy School, and a Master of Divinity and Doctorate of Theology in Religion and Society from Harvard Divinity School. We are very fortunate to have him here today, so please welcome Sean Casey.
Good morning, everyone. Let me begin by thanking Kadir and Anel and Sarah for this wonderful invitation to open up this great day of conversation and analysis of the very fascinating research that your team has done. It's an honor for me to be here this morning. I'm sorry I will not be here for the full day to hear what I'm sure will be quite interesting and engaging a conversation. But you're to be commended for this fascinating set of papers and analysis. I think you really do push the frontier of our understanding of this very important set of questions related to religious authority in the countries that you have examined. I think that the publication and dissemination marks real progress in deepening not only our understanding of religious authority among the leaders in these countries, but it's also a very nice signal that the modes of analysis available to diplomats is evolving in some very interesting and positive ways. On the one hand, I think we are light years away from what I hope was an era where earlier sets of alleged investigations began with inane questions like, why do they hate us? And can't anyone here write a counter narrative that will be effective in shutting down ISIS on Twitter? But more about that in a moment. So the good news is analysis is much more sophisticated than it was 6 years ago when I came into the State Department. The bad news is that the consumers inside the United States government who might actually be able to learn from this material, that demand has decreased. And we'll talk more about that in a moment or two. The Baker Institute has a very special place in my heart for many reasons. First of all, as many of you know, in April, almost exactly 3 years ago in 2016, Secretary Kerry traveled to Houston at the invitation of Secretary Baker to give a keynote speech on why he decided to launch an Office of Religion and Global Affairs in his own bureau. And he outlined the case for that, and Secretary Baker was eager to provide a very large platform and context for Kerry to make that speech. I commend it to you. It's available online, where he lays out the systematic case for why the State Department needs to grow its capacity to assess religious dynamics and engage religious actors along the lines we see advocated in these papers. In many ways, that speech marked the high water mark for our office that I directed. I had the pleasure of then speaking the next day to a group of students, and also later in November 2016. So the Baker Institute is a context where these issues are naturally part of their issue set. So I'm honored and I'm grateful that you are maintaining this tradition and this deep interest in this intersection of religion and global affairs. We received a warm welcome from Ambassador Tajarian on both visits, and I remain grateful to this day for your hospitality. Likewise, a dear friend of mine, and those of you who know the Baker Institute may know William C. Martin, who's something of a legend on Rice's campus. He's now a professor of sociology emeritus, and he maintains his larger-than-life presence on the Rice campus from his post at the Baker Institute. As an aside, he is my nominee for the first Texan who should be cloned. So far, no one has picked up on that recommendation, but if you know Bill, he is one of the country's most foremost scholars of religion and public life. And he embodies Rice's deep history of producing trenchant scholarship on the public consequences of religious belief and practice around the world. Let me draw you a quick roadmap of where I want to go in my brief remarks. I hope I finish in time so we have a moment or two for Q&A if you are so motivated. My remarks are focused around 5 questions. First, who should care about your research, and how can and should you reach them? Second, what exactly is religious authority, and are the social sciences the best or only way to get at that topic? Third, if we do have a sense of what religious authority means, are we arguably in an era that might be called a time of crisis for religious authority? Fourth, what about U.S. diplomacy in the area of religion and global affairs? What is going on the inside? And finally, if religion and global affairs are on the verge of extinction in U.S. diplomacy, see how deftly I just answered my last question. Is the victorious trope of religious freedom a sufficient substitute on the part of our government? So who exactly should care about this sort of research into religious authority in the Muslim majority countries chosen? The simplest answer is that American diplomats, to the extent the heart of the work of U.S. embassies and posts is interpreting host countries back to the State Department in D.C., they should care deeply about any form of research that shed lights on the political terrain, especially in countries that comprise the current research set. But sadly, that view has never been fully socialized in the State Department's DNA. We had a 3.5-year launch of trying to socialize the notion that every embassy and post should be a consumer of this kind of analysis. We made a dent in the DNA, but we did not transform it. So we made progress in the Kerry years, but it was really over before it got fully started. The tougher question then to those of you in this project is, how do you share your results given the less than hospitable landscape for your work? Let me give you 3 pieces of very pragmatic inside the Beltway advice. First, shop it to the intelligence community. To the extent there is interest in these sort of questions, it is primarily found there today. If you talk to members of the IC, they're still doing their professional work, but they have become educators and persuaders inside this administration where they have a group of political customers who are deeply suspect of the utility of this kind of analysis. So they still care even if the demand signal from the State Department and White House is virtually silent for their wares. Analysts still do their work on religion in and day out, even though they are often relegated to trying to educate their new political masters in the executive branch. But they still care passionately about this issue set. You're going to have to find them. And I'm willing to elaborate that pilgrimage later. Second, try to connect directly with senior career folk in the diplomatic force. In my time at State, there was nothing better for our work than an ambassador or deputy chief of mission who understood the wisdom and value of smart analysis of religious dynamics in their region or country. They actually are on email. They do respond to people on the outside, bringing analysis to them. Third, I recommend you invest time and energy in developing your own communication plan for your own product. A website is great. Digitizing these papers, that is great. But in the last 10 years, there's been an explosion of research and writing on religion in diplomacy. I can now say to you, much of that is of very poor quality. I still have shelves full of reports that are several years old in this space that I have not read. Much of that rightly rests unread. You cannot assume that simply because you wrote it, the right people are going to find it and be influenced by it. While I was at State, there was already beginning to be too much to read. So you have to ask yourself, who should be reading your research and how do you make it available? My next question gets more to the substance of the research, and that is, what exactly is, quote unquote, religious authority? And is social science the best or only way to get at it? Kadir, I appreciate your written remarks in introducing the work, but also your opening statement here about the nature of religious authority, because I think that's very, very helpful. I think there's a tacit acknowledgement in all the papers that religious authority is heavily dependent on the national political and religious climate. There really isn't any pure form of religious authority that can be distilled out of a national scenario and then compared and contrasted in a scientifically objective way across national boundaries. There is a reductionism with respect to religion in the State Department. What are the 5 pillars of Islam? You memorize that, you know everything you need to know about Islam in any country around the world. So this is essentially an essentialist approach. There's an essence of Islam that can be distilled and disseminated, and as long as every office and posting bureau knows that, that's all they need to know. We rejected that on the face of it in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs. Religion is always embedded and expressed in context and intersection with thousands of other dynamics. There is no essence of Christianity. There is no essence of Judaism. There's no essence of Islam. The State Department is going to need a lot of time and a lot of teaching before they move beyond this sort of essentialist approach. My fear is that some consumers of your data will simply say, well, we have a poll now about religious authority, and we understand who's up and who's down, and we need to think no further. Obviously, the papers build a sophisticated historical, political, and religious interpretation around the data, which is as it should be. My fear is that among some of your potential consumers in the U.S. government, they will read these polls as if they're a presidential political poll in the United States. Somebody's up by 10 points, somebody's down by 3 points, let's run towards the person who's up 10 points. And that's not the lessons to be drawn from these very sophisticated sets of analyses. But I'm simply saying you're vulnerable to being co-opted that way. So I think that the papers themselves provide historical background and context that make interpreting the social science that much more effective. But don't rely simply on the social science to answer the question, what is religious authority? And so I'm not accusing any of the papers of doing that, but my fear is that perhaps some of your less sophisticated consumers on the inside of the government will not see that. They'll simply rely on, well, this is today's tracking poll from Politico, so we need not do any more thinking beyond who's up and who's down. So my point is that it wouldn't hurt to think more deeply about what you think religious authority means. I happen to think it can be a useful shorthand, but it gets diabolically complicated pretty fast once you scratch the surface. As I said, I fear that some of the consumers of your research, not being as sophisticated as you researchers are, may reduce religious authority to simple formulas of popular support reflected in opinion surveys. And that's not what you're trying to do. My point here is that I want to argue that opinion surveys can be good servants, but they make lousy masters. And to be a bit crass, standalone data tells us less than multiple year surveys, which yields insights into comparison over time. it would be great if Luce would fund you to go back into the field every 2 years, every 3 years, so you have comparative data, so you can see, is the Dianet, is it going down or is it increasing its stature? And it's that comparative data that really begins to offer long-term insights about the status, the relative status of these various trend lines. So I'm happy to help Luce see the light in terms of more funding. I hope you have an opportunity to continue to go into the field and do these kinds of surveys such that you can have comparative data, say, over a decade, over 2 decades. Then you have an extra layer of really interesting sets of questions to wrestle with in terms of where are these dynamics going. Now, I'm not aware of a single convincing study on the meaning of religious authority. Any such one-size-fits-all abstract definition is doomed to failure. Depending on the particular patch of a particular religious tradition, embedded in specific political environments, systems, histories, cultures, religious authority can be inherited, it can be seized, it can be manufactured, it can be bestowed, it can be squandered, created, spent, faked, or imparted. Social science can shed light on this, but I would humbly suggest that a wider interdisciplinary conversation with historians, religious studies professors, anthropologists, etc., should be part of your ongoing conversations and analysis. Now, in asking my next question, I may be exposing myself to charges of hypocrisy or just plain old inconsistency, which I know is rarely found in academia. But with a cursory glance around the globe, it's not illogical to ask, are we in an era of significant decline in religious authority? If we rely only on survey data, it's tempting to answer in the affirmative. Certainly, a quick tour of global Christianity through the Orthodox world, through Roman Catholicism, through evangelicalism, through Pentecostalism, one could make an argument that religious authority in all of its complexity and permutations is on the decline. So there are even wider global sets of questions to be asked. And if the answer is yes, then the next question set is, well, why is this the case? The results of the country studies before us today might lend themselves to similar conclusions. Now, let me be clear, I'm not promoting this as a hard thesis, but it is worth pondering. It's also worth postponing a grand conclusion, especially when we talk to diplomats. I say this because diplomats are tempted to accept shorthand answers to cut to the chase, and the appeal of stereotypes is almost irresistible in the face of the complexity, especially when it comes to religion. Since religion is still a marginally acceptable subject for diplomats, reductive simplifying analysis can be a great relief and hence almost irresistible. To me, the real strength of these country studies is their emphasis on the unique political and religious configurations in each country. The upshot for you is to resist the temptation to draw grand theoretical conclusions, but I'm also saying, on the other hand, it's worth stepping back and saying, well, what are the dynamics and trend lines in terms of religious authority, particularly in the countries in the region that you're looking at? My fourth question is a tough one for me to ask, but I think it needs to be raised. Does the United States diplomatic apparatus today give a fig about research like this? I think the honest answer is that for the time being, no, it doesn't. And it gives me no pleasure to say that. We had a great run for 3.5 years in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, but it was not enough to change the slow-moving, change-resistant culture of what might be, indeed, the slowest changing sector in the entire federal government bureaucracy. We made a lot of friends. We made some real contributions to U.S. diplomacy, but we were swept away very, very quickly for ideological reasons in the current administration. Now, that's not to say there aren't pockets of real interest in questions like the nature of religious authority in the Middle East, but it's driven by individuals who care, not by bureaus or senior leaders that are seeking such answers. The subject captures the attention of smart people, but not enough to preserve the technical institutional capacity to absorb the diplomatic implications of these papers that existed once upon a time. But the subject of religion is not the only issue to be swept away by the current effort to restore American diplomacy's swagger. Multiple observers have noted that the current administration does not have a functioning foreign policy decision-making apparatus. Think about that for a moment. Let that sink in. As we're now on our third national security advisor in the White House, as you know, this position emerged in the modern presidential era as the curator and gatekeeper of our vast foreign policy network of analysis and expertise. The ideological bias of the current administration when it comes to religion further hampers the search for deeper understanding of religious dynamics. That bias consists of privileging one small religious community, fundamentalist white Christianity, at the expense of, say, understanding Islam, where the interests are only in kinetic solutions. But our diplomatic capacity is under a much broader assault, as can be seen from the radical purge of senior leaders and experts all across the State Department. Religion is not the only issue set that has suffered. It's the one that's most directly affected me, but to be honest, it's fairly far down the list in terms of the lack of expert capacity. When the president travels, he operates with the least amount of diplomatic expertise supporting him than any other president in the modern presidential era. Think about that. When he goes to Riyadh, he goes to Jerusalem, and he goes to Rome. On his first international trip, he had very precious little expertise on the religious dynamics of those three geographical locations with him. He sits across the table from international leaders with only marginal expertise advising him, if that much. It's a terrifying situation, and I'm growing increasingly fearful that 6 more years of this state of affairs may permanently damage America's standing in the world, to say nothing of our ability to shape and influence global affairs for the better. Now, it's not my intention to spoil today's discussions, but it needs to be said that the willingness of our diplomats to be consumers of expert analysis is being attacked on a daily systematic basis, and we may never see the day when something approaching normalcy returns. And this leads to my final question, and that is, can the pursuit of religious freedom by the current administration be a sufficient intellectual replacement of the type of work we did in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs and the type of analysis we find in today's papers? The short answer is no, it cannot. Religious freedom as practiced now is ideologically driven and frankly is not particularly interested in nuanced assessments of religious dynamics in Muslim countries. It is interested in promoting Christianity first and foremost, and is seen by that's seen by the anti-Islamic bona fides of so many of its senior political leaders. How can one proclaim religious freedom for all and simultaneously promote a Muslim ban with a straight face? That's appalling, chilling, and beyond belief, but that is in fact where we are with respect to religious dynamics. Now let me close on a somewhat less somber note. I'm in the process of reading Bill Burns' terrific new book, The Back Channel, a memoir of American diplomacy in the case for its renewal. We are, after all, in his house, and I want to tell you that it is a very powerful book, even though I'm not finished with it. I'm still reading as we speak. But its power is multivalent, and so far, I think its greatest trait for me is the portrait of what American diplomacy can once again be. And I should note that his portrait of Secretary Baker is quite compelling and quite fascinating, and that's worth the read on its own. It's a powerful antidote to the current assault on the American diplomatic institutions. He skillfully shows the limits as well as the potential for American diplomacy, and he's making an argument to try to return to that stance where making the world a better place and not being captive to narrow populist and anti-pluralist interests is in fact in America's interest. Buy the book, read it, digest it, and be inspired about the heights of what our diplomacy can accomplish once again. And don't give up the hard work of laboring to understand the infinitely complex study of religion and its implications for improving the state of the world. Thank you again to today's paper writers, and good luck with the rest of today's discussion. I think we do have time for a few questions. So. Yeah, just raise your hands and the microphone will come.
I'm Peter Humphrey, intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. One of the things I found at State was our cultural secularity prevents us from making certain diplomatic approaches or implications. For example, I tried to include a Quranic verse in a white paper, and it was immediately expunged. I once suggested we demarche a major masjid that was causing some problems. Almost lost my head over that. This unwillingness of State to play the game on their fields rather than ours, to occasionally quote the Quran rather than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is killing us. What can you do about that?
Well, let me refer back to something Kadir said. You Google me, and I am a Christian by training, and I've discovered that actually Google outside the boundaries of the United States, which is kind of interesting. So many times when I would met with religious leaders who were not Christian, they knew more about me than I knew about them. And part of my anxiety was, well, do I look like the American Christian guy who's there to sort of have a new form of crusade? And to my distinct pleasure, the overwhelming majority of international religious leaders were happy the State Department was sending somebody who had at least some sympathy and some understanding about religious dynamics around the world. I often, you would go in and eventually you want to get to good conversations by asking good questions and then shutting up and listening. But we have often had to go through phases at the beginning of a conversation where, particularly in the Islamic world, there was a lot of anger about bad American policy. I felt no need to defend that American policy. Now some of my State Department handlers were very upset when I said, yeah, that invasion thing in 2003 really was not a very good decision on our government's part. But people were stunned that affirming a huge part of America's problem in the Middle East stemmed from bad American foreign policy and bad military policy. So we tried to model. So I think when I got to the State Department, most people would recognize, as Secretary Kerry did, who had a deep intuition, we had missed a lot of diplomatic opportunities because we refused to engage with religious actors. We refused to assess religious dynamics and context. Our office tried to model both. How do you model engagement, and how do you bring a more sophisticated set of analytical lenses to these questions? So the resistance I met was not, should we be doing this work, which was quite interesting to me. I didn't encounter that kind of hardcore resistance. The tougher question is, how do you do this work? Because it can be done gloriously incorrectly. It can be highly counterproductive. So we had to think long and hard more on the how do you do this work question than should we do it. So in that sense, I think the question has now evolved, at least in the American intellectual context. It makes perfect sense to ask questions about religious authority in these countries. 15 years ago, it probably wouldn't have made sense intellectually, publicly, and within the bureaucracy. The much tougher question then is, how do you do this work of assessing religious dynamics and engaging religious actors? We modeled that. We commended that to embassies and posts, and that was one of our central missions. But my argument was always, that's going to be almost a generational thing. That if we convince the State Department to make it weave it into its DNA that every embassy has a religious landscape and they know the players and they understand the dynamics, our office could disappear. So we were there really on a training mission, and if in 20 years we had accomplished our work, then the Office of Religion and Global Affairs could disappear. Now, 3.5 years was not long enough to socialize those missions. Thank you. That was a great question.
My name is David Loudon. I'm a policy analyst. How do you go about examining and improving or setting policy that is based on the conditions of particular countries or regions without getting bogged down in the personalities that you have to deal with, so that it's not personality centric but based on the actual conditions?
Personalities in terms of in the American government, or personalities in the countries? Okay, all right. I was thinking about some personalities inside the building, but well, no. I mean, you obviously you have to pay attention to both. I mean, if you assess, if you had done all of these social scientific research questions and didn't ask about specific leaders and specific personalities, you'd be no substance to your work. So you have to deal with personalities as well as institutions. But if it's just about institutions or just about personalities, you really don't get the full texture, the complexity of how religion is lived in any country I'm aware of. Now, it is true, I read a lot of analysis in my almost 4 years in the State Department that focused exclusively on leaders. And I think that's a mistake. We often drew this distinction between engaging leaders and what we called lived religion. What does it mean to be a member of a particular religious community at a particular local level? And there were often huge gaps in our understanding between what national religious leaders were saying and what rank and file folk were doing. And many times there were episodes where rank and file communities did stuff that their leaders were surprised by. So, but it's much easier to simply say, well, here are the 5 most important religious leaders in this country. Let's follow them and let's examine them, and our work here is done. The problem is that's an incomplete picture, and they many times are selling a particular interpretation of religion in their country that doesn't always map onto the lived reality. It's much harder to do the analysis of what's going at the grassroots level for 1,000 different reasons. But oftentimes that analysis, so this is where a scientific survey actually does provide you insights into what people are thinking at the grassroots level. So you have to do both. You can't ignore one at great peril. So I think you have to do both. And then to make it more complicated, you have to look at mediating institutions between the grassroots and national leaders. So it's diabolically complex. And that's one of the reasons why I think diplomats are afraid to embrace this as a form of analysis, because it's bloody hard work. But thank you, that's a great question. Maybe time for one more?
In your capacity as the Director of Office of Religion and Global Affairs, how were you received over in the region, in your interactions with religious leaders, you or your office in general, or citizens of those countries? Do you have any examples that might shed some light into what kind of a role such an office or religion in general might play?
No, I think we were met almost universally with gratefulness that someone was showing up with at least a rudimentary understanding of what was happening in specific religious communities. They were not used to seeing American diplomats show up with that kind of interest and capacity. We weren't selling something to them in most occasions. One of the first things I realized when I had 2 realizations when I first came into the State Department. Number one is I knew a very tiny slice of global religion. And the notion of having 30 people, if there's 7 billion people on the planet, there are probably 70 billion forms of religious expression to be found. The notion that 30 people were going to understand global religious dynamics was absurd on the face of it. So, number one, I realized if we were going to be successful, we had to persuade the regional bureaus that our work and analysis would make them more successful in their strategic regional goals. So we had a team of regional advisors, each one assigned to one of the 6 regional bureaus, where we met with the Assistant Secretary and said, show us your strategic regional goals. We'll come back with a plan of how our analysis can help you be successful in pursuing your goals. That then opened doors for us in those regions when people in the regional bureaus would call us in and say, we got a problem here, we've got an interesting thing going over there. Can you come in and help us understand what's going on? The other piece of it was, and Peter Mandeville here can confirm or contradict what I'm going to say, we had as deep an analytical grasp of dynamics in the Islamic world of any office in the executive branch outside the intelligence community. And that's, I hired people who knew what I didn't know. I'm by no means an expert in that part of the world. And I can't even fake it with any kind of competency. So we developed a capacity that opened up doors for us around the world. There were times we would travel, or people in our staff would travel, and we'd get meetings with country leaders that the ambassador himself or herself could not get on their own, because we were there with a level of sophisticated understanding of religious dynamics. So, I mean, certainly there were doors that were slammed in our face, but on the other hand, I think we got access to a lot of conversation partners around the world that no one else in the U.S. government was able to do. Well, thank you very much. I think time is of the essence, and I don't want to backstop the rest of today's conversation. Thank you so much for being here again. Congratulations on your work product.